The US warned Iran. No less than President Donald Trump said that if the killing of protesters didn't stop, there would be hell to pay. But protesters still died on the streets. Others were arrested and executed. And finally, the US is preparing to put its money where its mouth is. US warships just arrived on Iran's doorstep, and something very bad is going to happen. The clock is ticking for Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, and he knows it. January 26th saw several outlets report on a major move that the US has made to demonstrate that it's willing to throw real power behind its posturing. According to the Washington Post, the aircraft carrier USS Abraham Lincoln has arrived near Iran, along with its carrier strike group. Currently sailing deeper into the Middle East, the carrier is setting up in preparation for what might come next, be that strikes or the use of the carrier and America's other forces to push Iran into the regime change for which its protesters have been fighting for weeks. A lot of what happens next will depend on what Trump really wants, and we'll explore all of that later in the video. For now, we know that the USS Abraham Lincoln is escorted by 3 destroyers and has just moved from the western Indian Ocean, which was outside the range needed to easily strike Iran, and is expected to move into either the North Arabian Sea or the Gulf of Oman in the coming days. According to the Washington Post, the carrier strike group poses a pretty massive threat on its own. The USS Abraham Lincoln itself is crewed by 5,000 sailors and is carrying dozens of fighter jets primed and waiting to deliver their explosive munitions via airstrikes. The 3 destroyers accompanying the carrier, the USS Frankie Peterson Jr., the USS Michael Murphy, and the USS Spruance, also have dozens of missiles between them and, crucially, contain air defenses that may be able to defend the strike group against incoming Iranian drones and missiles. Trump has been more than keen to let Iran know what's coming. Speaking to reporters on January 22nd, he offered some hints that the carrier group was on its way. "We have a big flotilla going in that direction, and we'll see what happens. We have a big force going toward Iran. I'd rather not see anything happen, but we're watching them very closely," the War Zone, or TWZ, reports Trump as claiming. Trump added that this group was an armada, and, as is so often the case with the US president, he left his true intentions open to interpretation, as he said, "We have a massive fleet heading in that direction, and maybe we won't have to use it. We'll see." The same outlet also adds some details about what the USS Abraham Lincoln carrier strike group is bringing to the potential fight. TWZ says that the carrier itself consists of 8 squadrons of pilots that fly a range of aircraft, including F-35C Lightning IIs, FA-18EF Super Hornets, E-2D Hawkeyes, MH-60RS Seahawks, CMV-22B Ospreys, and EA-18G Growlers. It's a large assortment of aircraft and offers versatility in terms of optics and attack options. However, the carrier group hasn't been accompanied by influxes of air power in other locations that the US would use to stage strikes against Iran. The US-based Diego Garcia, which is in the Indian Ocean, has seen no deployment of bombers. However, there have been flights of C-17 Globemaster III cargo jets to that base, so it's possible that the US is slowly setting up for something. The US has also sent Patriot and Terminal High Altitude Area Defense, or THAAD, air defense systems to the Middle East, which are presumably being deployed to fend off any retaliation that Iran musters up. But we're getting ahead of ourselves here. Interestingly, the UK is showing signs that it may get involved in whatever's coming. TWZ says that online flight trackers have recorded that several F-15E Strike Eagles, along with some KC-135 Stratotanker aerial refueling aircraft, have also left their base at Royal Air Force Lakenheath en route to the Middle East. The UK has also deployed the Typhoon squadron that it shares with Qatar to the Gulf region for what its Ministry of Defense claims are defensive purposes. TWZ also speculates that this slowly growing force will add to other assets that the US has in the Middle East, including other fighter jets at bases near Iran, a trio of Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyers, and perhaps even a submarine hiding under the depths in the waters near Iran. This terrifying attack force is moving ever closer to Iran. The response from the country's regime is expected. The Washington Post says that Iran's regime has placed the country's armed forces on high alert, per a senior Iranian official who spoke to reporters on January 23rd in the wake of Trump's hints about the incoming carrier group. Initially, that official seemed hopeful that things would de-escalate, stating, "This military buildup, we hope that it's not something for real confrontation, but we are ready for the worst-case scenario." However, the official added that should the US strike, the Iranian response would be far greater than that seen in the wake of the 12-day war with Israel. The official claims Iran didn't consider to be an existential threat. Iran tried to be very restrained, predictable, and measured in its responses to both Israelis and Americans, the official claimed before adding, This time, we'd take any attack, limited, unlimited, surgical, kinetic, whatever they call it, as an all-out war against us, and we will respond in the hardest way possible. As common as it is for Iran to threaten retaliation against a potential aggressor, this threat needs to be taken seriously. That's according to the Times of Israel's David Kozakaru, who said in a January 22nd opinion piece that the Iranian regime may decide to move fast and escalate across multiple vectors if it believes that whatever the US is about to do could threaten the regime's existence. This escalation could include attacks on America's assets and military bases throughout the Middle East region, Kozakaru theorizes, in addition to taking action to disrupt global energy flows, along with likely attacks against Israel. The Strait of Hormuz, which Iran can attempt to shut off, is a big pressure point as about a fifth of the world's petroleum liquids, amounting to roughly 20 million barrels daily, sail through the strait. So Iran is certainly not without retaliatory options, though how realistic those options are is still a matter for debate. After all, Iran had the option of conducting strikes or similar actions in the Strait of Hormuz during its brief war with Israel, but didn't. It also didn't use the strait as a pressure point when the US and Israel cooperated on Operation Midnight Hammer, which saw 125 US military aircraft cooperate to strike a trio of Iran's nuclear facilities during the summer of 2025. So, could all of Iran's threats of counterattacking be little more than hot air? Not necessarily. In the wake of Operation Midnight Hammer, Iran did attack a US military base in Qatar. Iran launched missiles and witnesses reported loud bangs in the sky above the Qatari capital of Doha. However, the response was nowhere near the scale of the operation that preceded it, with even Trump calling the attack very weak and expected. Still, the attack does set a precedent in the sense that Iran may at least try to follow through on the threats that it presents, even if those threats aren't as powerful as its regime's rhetoric claims them to be. YouTuber Max Afterburner, who is a former F-16 and F-15E fighter pilot, notes that Iran certainly has the rhetoric in place. Afterburner claims that Iran is trying its hardest to let the US know that it has anti-ship missiles that it could use to attack the USS Abraham Lincoln and its strike group. They're basically trying to say that their anti-ship missiles can reach out and touch the carrier strike group, Afterburner states, adding, 1,200 nautical mile range on some of those, and they're saying these hypersonics are what could be the real muscle against the USS Abraham Lincoln, so they've got the rhetoric flying all around. Iran certainly does have anti-ship missiles. As WIO News reports on January 24th, it actually has several that could pose a serious threat if the American carrier strike group gets within range. The Khalij Fars ballistic missile, which is also known as the Persian Gulf, has a 300-kilometer or 186-mile range, carries a 650 kilogram or around 1,433-pound warhead, and may be able to reach speeds of up to Mach 4. Iran's Noor and Qader systems offer coastal defense against ships that come very close. The Zulfiqar Basir reportedly fires via a mobile launch system and has a 700-kilometer or 434-mile range. And finally, the Abu Mahdi cruise missile supposedly flies at low altitudes, uses AI to adjust its flight path as it hurtles toward its target, and has a range of more than 1,000 kilometers, or about 621 miles, allegedly. Whether these specifications hold up in combat situations, especially one as powerful as the US is sending Iran's way, is open for speculation. Iran may also be activating proxies in other countries, as Afterburner speculates. European airlines are actually cancelling or rerouting flights around Iran, Iraq, and Israel right now to stay clear of this mess, he says. All while Iran's proxy forces in Iraq and Yemen are openly signaling that they're ready to strike US assets as well. So it's not just the direct threat from Iran that the US has to worry about, assuming the country's regime isn't bluffing as its streets are being filled with the bodies and blood of protesters. Proxies could also enter the fight, creating a less predictable situation if whatever the US does next sparks an all-out war. But again, it's possible that this is all just the Iranian regime attempting to project the type of power that it either doesn't have or that it knows the US can overwhelm. After all, Iran didn't have much of an answer for Operation Midnight Hammer outside of a fairly weak, in Trump's words, strike on a US base in Qatar. And according to Afterburner, all of the rhetoric we're hearing now may be more a sign of Iran being a tiny dog backed into a corner from which it can't escape than it is of a country that's ready to fight with the US. They're that chihuahua backed into the corner that's like, I'm going to bite your ankles, I'm going to take you down, Afterburner says. Take it all with a grain of salt, is his recommendation. But even taking that into account, the reality is that the US has sent a carrier strike group toward Iran, and Iran's regime is threatening a military response that it claims hopes never has to come. All of this leaves us with two big questions. Why is this happening right now, and what does the US, and Trump in particular, plan on doing next? Keep watching to the end to find out what might come next. As for why all of this is happening, We touched on it earlier when we told you that protesters have been flooding Iran's streets for weeks now. It all started when shopkeepers, angry about the state of the Iranian economy, took to the streets to express their displeasure. They were soon joined by others who stood against Iran's ruling regime, and it wasn't long before a small protest ballooned into a massive emergency for Khamenei and his cronies. The US has supported Iran's protesters all the way, at least with words, if not direct action, up until this point. Trump quickly threatened to strike Iran if its regime started killing protesters, and he's also encouraged the protests several times in the weeks since they began. For instance, January 13th saw the US president take to Truth Social to declare, "Iranian patriots, keep protesting, take over your institutions, save the names of the killers and abusers, they will pay a big price. I have cancelled all meetings with Iranian officials until the senseless killing of protesters stops. Help is on its way. MIGA." The day after this post, TWZ reported that Trump was claiming that his threats of US retaliation for Iran's regime attacking protesters had worked. "We were told that the killing in Iran is stopping and stopping, and there's no plan for executions, or an execution, or executions. So I've been told that on good authority. We'll find out about it," Trump said in a statement to the press. Trump and his administration certainly did find out about it. The killing was far from over, and it's still going on. Just how many people have been killed is the only real question. We know that the BBC reported that Khamenei himself had acknowledged that thousands of people had died in the protests by January 17th. That acknowledgement came in the wake of a report by the US-based Iranian human rights activist news agency, which claimed at the time that the Iranian regime's crackdown on the budding revolution had claimed the lives of 3,090 people. The number now appears to be much, much higher. On January 26th, the Japan Times reported two estimates. It said that Mai Sato, who is the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the human rights situation in Iran, said that the estimated number earlier in the week was 5,000. The reports from doctors in Iran suggested it could be as high as 20,000. The same agency that the BBC quoted also put the number at 5,002 verified deaths, though it was also investigating 9,787 other potential protest-related deaths as of January 26th. However, Times magazine says that the number may be even higher than the largest of these estimates. In a January 25th report, Time reported that two senior officials in Iran's Ministry of Health had told the outlet that up to 30,000 Iranians may have died between January 8th and January 9th alone. The situation was so bad, the officials claimed that the scale of death had overwhelmed Iran's health services to the point where stocks of body bags had been exhausted and some of the dead were being transported on semi-trailers rather than ambulances. Time does note that this figure has yet to be independently verified, but 30,000 deaths in 2 days is enormous. Even if that figure is inaccurate, we know for certain that there have been thousands of deaths, despite Trump's claims that the US would take action if Iran's regime didn't stop the killing. On top of the deaths, the regime has been cracking down on the protests in several other ways. Amnesty International reports that Khamenei's regime had ordered mass internet shutdowns as early as January 8th, which the organization claims was an attempt by the regime to hide the crimes that it was committing. Thousands of Iranians have also been arrested for taking part in the protests, with the Washington Post claiming that the number is over 20,000. Now the protests are over, at least according to Iran, and those who survived their attempts to demonstrate their displeasure against Iran's regime aren't happy about the lack of a US response. Those who risk their lives inside Iran to demonstrate have said they feel betrayed by the US president's inaction, the Washington Post reports. The USS Abraham Lincoln carrier strike group headed toward Iran now looks like a case of better late than never, if we're being charitable. Still, it brings us right back to the question that we mentioned several times already during this video: what happens next? The answer to that question relies heavily on what Trump hopes or believes can be achieved following what has to go down as the weakening of Iran's regime. On January 13th, the BBC reported that it was decision time for Trump, and that his actions in the coming weeks would dictate what happens next in Iran. The BBC quoted Will Toddam, who is a senior fellow in the Middle Eastern program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, who said, "It's hard to tell exactly what course of action Trump is likely to take, given we don't know what the full aim is here." Toddam went on to add that Trump may be more interested in influencing Iran's regime rather than toppling it. "I think the risks of regime change are so great that I don't yet believe that is his primary objective here," Toddam claimed, adding, "It could be more concessions in the nuclear talks. It could be to stop the crackdown. It also could be to try to implement reforms that lead to some sort of sanctions relief. Better the devil you know than the one you don't, perhaps." However, if Trump has decided that now is the time for regime change in Iran, the "what happens next" question has to cover two angles: what the US will attack and who replaces Iran's regime. In terms of any strike carried out by the USS Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group and the other forces the US has amassed near Iran, The Guardian says they would be unlikely to strike Iran's nuclear facilities again. Operation Midnight Hammer already did that, though there are questions about how effective that operation ended up being, and the US likely won't be interested in copying its own homework for future strikes. The BBC speculated on January 13th that a limited strike, perhaps attacking Iranian military nodes or even commanders, could have helped to encourage Iran's protesters while putting its ruling regime on notice. But if Iran is to be believed, the time for such a strike has come and gone, assuming it's telling the truth about quelling the protests. With that opportunity gone, perhaps the US will instead strike at Khamenei himself. If so, that might be tough, as the Jerusalem Post reports that Iran's supreme leader has been moved into a fortified underground shelter that contains a series of tunnels, which will make him hard to pin down and kill or extract. But if we assume that the US does take out Khamenei, it also eliminates the devil it knows, and if it does that, somebody has to fill the power vacuum. Max Afterburner suggests that the US Secretary of State Marco Rubio's recent visit to Iraq, where he warned the country against supporting Iran's regime, may have represented the US setting up for a new future that sees a civilian leader take power in Iran. Marco Rubio going to Iraq is potentially preparing the region for an Ayatollah-less Iran that has a civilian leader, Afterburner claims in what he calls a 4D chess move by the US. Such an outcome would certainly seem beneficial for Iran. The US might position itself as an ally of the new leaders, which would be huge for a country that has been so heavily impacted by American sanctions. Iraq and Saudi Arabia could also become erstwhile and direct allies, with such a move marking a huge geopolitical shift in the Middle East region that could, theoretically, spread US influence far and wide. But this is just a theory. Right now, all we know is that a carrier strike group is approaching Iran, and as is so often the case, Trump is being coy about whether a strike is imminent or whether he is deploying yet another of his negotiation tactics.